Dobro. History. Archive.
So you've probably clicked on this thinking we're going to talk about Cynthia, right? The whole story about the first big AI political scandal, a ghost in the machine built to trick an entire country, a scary preview of our digital future. And yeah, you came here for that story. But the real story, well, it's way older. And you know, your instinct is spot on. This is about a woman who never existed, a woman who totally fooled the country. But her name wasn't Cynthia. It was Lene. And she wasn't cooked up by some algorithm. No. This was built piece by painful piece by hand, by one single deeply tormented person. It's a story that absolutely consumed the nation. All right, let's get into it. See, before this whole thing became a hoax, it was a story about a hero. And his story, for a little while at least, was maybe the most perfect tragedy in the history of American sports. Seriously, if you were going to build the perfect sports hero in a lab, you'd probably end up with Manti Te'o. This guy was an absolute monster of a linebacker for Notre Dame, the most legendary program in college football. But it was more than just his talent. He had this aura of genuine decency and faith. He was the golden boy in every single way. And back in 2012, the media, they didn't just love him. They believed in him. And then this happens. And it all happens with just brutal, unbelievable speed. In the span of like a few hours, Te'o loses his grandmother. And then his girlfriend, Lenny Kukua, supposedly dies from leukemia. The entire country is mourning with this kid. And then what does he do? Just 3 days later, he goes out on the field and has one of the best games of the entire season. I mean, it was like something straight out of a movie. The hero overcoming this impossible grief. And this is where you see how the media wasn't just reporting the story, they were helping write the myth. This quote, it's from that now infamous Sports Illustrated cover story, and it's pure poetry, right? All these intimate, heartbreaking details. This wasn't really journalism. It was practically sainthood. Everyone wanted the perfect hero story so badly that nobody stopped to ask even the most basic questions. Okay, so now let's talk about how it all came crashing down. The perfect story, it started to crack a little bit on the football field itself, but what really shattered it into a million pieces? A single anonymous email. So you've got this incredible contrast, right? On one side, you have the giants of sports media. We're talking Sports Illustrated, ESPN, CBS. They're all building and broadcasting this incredible legend of Manti Te'o and Lenny Kukua. And then, on the other side, you've got Deadspin, a kind of snarky, irreverent sports blog that basically made its name tearing down exactly those kinds of myths. They get a tip in their inbox, and unlike literally everyone else, they actually decide to look into it. And this is what's so wild. The investigation that took down this massive national story, it wasn't some complex, high-tech thing. It was just basic journalism, like Journalism 101. The reporters, Timothy Burke and Jack Dickey, they just did the simple stuff. They looked for a death certificate, couldn't find one. They called Stanford, where Lene was supposed to be a student. Nope, no record of her there either. The entire thing just completely fell apart with a couple of phone calls. So the last piece of the puzzle was a simple reverse image search. And that's when two key people popped up. The face that everyone thought was Linnea Kekwa, it actually belonged to a woman named Diane O'Mara, who was, very much alive. And she knew exactly who'd been stealing her photos, an old high school acquaintance named Renaya Toya Sopo. And just like that, the hoax had a face and the hoaxer had a name. So that brings us to the next part of the story, because the question totally shifts from what happened to the much, much more complicated questions of who did this and why. And to really get the motive here, you have to understand this quote. For the person who created Lenny Kukua, this was never about trying to be malicious. They called it an escape. It was this desperate way to find themselves, to live out an identity that just felt completely impossible in the real world. Okay, so here's the absolute crucial piece of context. Renaya Tui Sapo, the person behind the hoax, is a transgender woman who now goes by Naya. And you have to remember, back in 2013, the public just didn't really have a way to understand what that meant. For Naya, creating Lene was her way of finally living as the woman she knew she was. It was an escape from all the pressure to be this big football player to make her family happy. But then, things got messy. She actually fell in love with Manti Te'o. And that, right there, just completely reframes the whole scandal. But we can't forget, in this whole tragic triangle, there was a third person. Someone who wasn't a victim of a broken heart or a difficult personal journey, but a victim of a straight-up digital crime. Diane O'Meara. Her entire identity was stolen. Her face was suddenly the face of a massive national scandal that she had absolutely nothing to do with.
All right, let's swing the focus back to Manti Te'o. Because once the hoax was out in the open, the conversation across the country really boiled down to one single damning question. Was this guy a victim, or was he in on it?
And again, you have to put yourself back in that time. Today, everybody knows what catfishing is. But in January 2013, the term was basically brand new. That documentary and the MTV show, they had just come out. So people's first reaction wasn't sympathy. Not at all. It was total skepticism. The question everyone was asking wasn't, wow, how could this happen to him? It was, how could he possibly be that stupid? People just could not wrap their heads around the idea that he was just a victim. And this timeline, this is what really sealed the deal for the public. On December 6th, this is weeks before the Deadspin story even comes out, Te'o gets a call, and it's Lene's voice on the other end, telling him she's not dead. But then, and this is the part that got him, 2 days later, he's at the Heisman Trophy ceremony, and he's still talking about his dead girlfriend. Look, it's one thing to get fooled, it's a whole other thing to know something is really, really wrong and to keep telling the story anyway. That was the lie. So why? Why did he lie? When he finally went on TV for that first disastrous interview, he didn't have some slick, media-trained answer. He just had this. The completely raw, panicked words of a 21-year-old kid whose entire life had basically just exploded during the biggest moment of his career. He was just plain scared. The myth had gotten so much bigger than him, and he had no idea how to make it stop. And you know where it all started? With a much smaller lie. A lie that's actually pretty relatable. He told his dad that he'd met Linnea in person. Why'd he do that? Pure embarrassment. I mean, think about it. He's this deeply religious kid, a superstar athlete, and he was just ashamed to admit that the supposed love of his life was someone he'd only ever known online. That one little lie, that was the tiny crack that allowed this entire massive hoax to flood in. Which brings us to our final chapter, the absolutely devastating fallout for Te'o right after this all broke, and how, nearly a decade later, the entire story got a second look. And the consequences were just catastrophic. Manti Te'o went from being a guaranteed top 10 NFL draft pick to being totally toxic. His draft stock just plummeted. He fell all the way to the second round, which cost him literally millions of dollars. But honestly, worse than the money was the public humiliation. He became a national punchline. He even wound up on a most disliked athletes list right next to Lance Armstrong. And what was his crime? Being naive and then lying because he was scared. And for almost a decade, that's pretty much where the story stayed, just frozen in time. But then, look at this shift. By 2022, how people saw both Manti and Naya had done a complete 180. The guy who was seen as either a dupe or a liar was now seen as a symbol of grace and resilience. And the person seen as a malicious hoaxer was now understood as a deeply complex, tragic figure. So, what happened? What changed? Well, a Netflix documentary happened. The series Untold finally gave both Manti and Naya a platform to tell their own sides of the story, but with years of hindsight and maturity. The public was frankly wiser by then. We had a much better understanding of things like gender identity, so people could finally hear Naya's story. And they saw Manti not as a confused kid, but as a man who had somehow survived this unbelievable public trial and found a way to forgive. And that's really the big takeaway here. This story was never about AI. It was always a deeply, deeply human story about identity, about loneliness, about deception. You could almost call it the first major sociological deepfake, but one that was built by hand, piece by painful piece out of human suffering. And that leaves us with a pretty chilling question for today. If that took one person years to build by hand, what happens now when a machine can do it in seconds?